I had a subtitle for this talk of 60 years of reflection, and I've lowered that down to 40 years, and I should finish by 7 or 8 o'clock tonight. I began my study in the 1970s when I worked at the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts. I think it was like 1976. And at that time, I lived in East Douglas, Massachusetts, south of Worcester, by about 15 miles. And sometime, I'm not sure exactly when, I met Malcolm Pearson, whom you may know of his involvement with the Upton Chamber and America's Stonehenge, both of which he owned, by the way. Many of you may not know that. And he invited me to come with him on a couple of field trips, one of which was to the Richards Chamber in Putney, Vermont, which is in the southern part of Vermont. I didn't take this photograph, but this is taken at the Richards Chamber in Putney, Vermont, which is the only chamber that we know of that one enters through a hole in the roof. There's a hole right there, and there's stones around it to keep people from falling in, I presume. And this was being investigated in 1978 by Jim Woodall of the Early Sites Research Society. And I went there with Malcolm one day, and I just observed what was going on. I didn't understand any of this. I was new to the field. Here's another view of the Richards Chamber with this wall around a portion of it. I've forgotten exactly how that thing looked, but the fact that you enter it through a hole in the roof is really unusual. It's not quite a chamber, as I would think of it. It's more like a kiva that one finds out west. And Jim Woodall spent quite a bit of time studying this, and he obtained a soil sample from the base of the mound, which he sent to a lab to have radiocarbon dating done. And he obtained a date of 595 AD, and just recently another OSL sample was obtained from the mound, and that came to 590 AD, so that's quite unusual. So after Malcolm showed me this mound, he then invited me to go to the Morrill Point Mound, which is in Salisbury, Massachusetts, along the coast, not too far from where the Merrimack River enters the ocean. And that mound was being investigated also by Jim Woodall, and that mound dates back, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 years. And I observed it from from the edge of what Jim Woodall was doing. I didn't understand quite what was going on, but anyway, he was digging there without authorization, and finally he was asked to leave. But he did a good job, I think, of following the methodology. And in fact, that in one of the films that Ted Timrick has done, 2 archaeologists are interviewed about the quality of work that Jim Woodall did at the time, and they were very impressed. So, and also Jim Woodall tested a lot of these mounds that he investigated with radiocarbon dating. And there's a list of those somewhere, and I've seen them. And I think a lot of those dates should be taken very, very carefully. And then in 1981, I moved to Princeton University, and for about the next 10 years, I worked very carefully at my conservation work at the museum, and also working to teach, and I taught a course on the history of painting techniques. And in 1990s, I think it was, I was reading an article by Steve Ells, who was a Thoreau scholar, about the Estabrook Woods in Concord, Massachusetts. And I remembered back that I was on an orienteering meet in the Estabrook Woods, in which I came across a log structure. So I told Steve Ells about it, and he invited me to go on a walk with him through the Estabrook Woods. And at one point, after I'd shown Steve this log structure, he said, "Would you be interested to see an above-ground stone chamber?" And I said, "Stone chamber?" I wasn't quite sure what he was talking about. But he said, "Follow me." So we did, and we started probably close to where that green patch is, and then went over here, and this is the wall here, and there's a little dot right there, and that represents the stone chamber. This is an orienteering map that people who do that sport, which is really very athletic in many cases, and very interesting. You learn how to use a compass and a map. So we walked over there, following this colonial wall here, and all of a sudden, we came to the chamber above ground, as you see here. And I looked at it, and there was no roof. There was a couple of areas inside. What it was used for, I have no idea. But I asked him, "Steve, can you tell me more about it?" And he said, "Well, you should get in touch with Mark Strohmeyer, who was living somewhere outside of Boston." And Steve gave me his phone number. So when I got back to Massachusetts, I called him, and it turns out this chamber was written up by Mark and sent to Harvard University, which owns the land on which represents this portion of the Estabrook Woods. I didn't obtain a copy of the mound, but Steve told me to buy a copy of Manitou by Maver and Dix, read it, and once I had done so, give him a call back, and we could talk more, which is what I did. And then he said, "You should get in touch with my high school friend, Fred Werkheiser," which is what I did. This goes back to like 1998, 1997. So I went on a couple of field trips with Fred, one of which was a site called Scott Run, which is probably not too far from here, I'm not sure. And this is a map that I drew of the site after I'd been there. And the most interesting thing was that there were these two walls which you see, these two parallel walls here, more or less oriented east-west. And about here was a small chamber, and then there were stone mounds on either side of the wall. So this is the chamber, still there, hopefully. And what interested me in this photograph was the fact that you have a triangular stone at the back here. That should be examined more carefully. And here's the other parallel wall to the one you see in the foreground. And the chamber is big enough so you can crawl in, but what it might have been used for, I have no idea. And this is the back wall, which this faces east. And what's interesting about it is that it has a vertical face, and then it tapers down on the other side. And there are two walls similar in structure at the Olie Hills Site to this, and I think that this is a design that was used by the Native Americans in the Northeast. So the next site that Fred showed me was this site here. In early November in 1997, after an ice storm had covered everything with about a quarter of an inch of ice from the night before. So it was kind of wet walking, and we approached the site from the west, off the map here. First coming to this flat top cairn B, then going to this flat top cairn A, then to the boulder, and this row platform, then the terrace, and then eventually to platform B that you see there. So we were really going around in a counterclockwise direction. And the first feature we saw here was this large platform cairn, which is built against a large boulder, or more than one actually, very precisely built. This was taken after the first visit that I went on. And this was taken on that first visit on November the 3rd, 1997. And here you see a curved wall in the foreground leading to the mound in the background. And it turns out that this wall actually begins by emerging from the ground. It appears to be emerging, such as a serpent would. And the other wall, I'm not sure whether that emerges from the ground too, but there's another curved wall on the site. And the next thing we went to was this boulder, which is actually the heart of the Oley Hills Site. And I invited a state geologist, Bill Savon, to visit the site, which he did with his wife in 1998. And he pointed out some important aspects about the site. The fact that the last ice sheet, Wisconsin ice sheet, ended its southern movement about 40 miles north of the Olie Hillside. So any kind of anomalous material, stone, whatever found on the ground, would have to have been brought there from the valley below and not deposited by the ice sheet. And he pointed out too, Bill Savon, that at the other end, on the north end of the boulder underneath, were these two small stacks of stone. And he surmised that the boulder originally rocked, and that these small stones were put underneath to keep the boulder from rocking. At first, when I saw the boulder, before I had invited Bill Savon there, I assumed that this was a glacial erratic, but it isn't. It's called a tor, T-O-R, which is a boulder that has broken off from a ledge and is weathered in place. It has the same lithology as the bedrock on which it rests. And the other feature that I saw that day was this row platform, which actually looks like a snake. If you remember the map I showed, it curves up and curves around in front of the boulder. And it's flat on top, consists of this surface of small stones, so one could stand on it, and presumably some kind of ceremonial activity might have occurred on top of that surface facing the boulder that you see there. And the other main feature is this, what I call the terrace, which is in front of the boulder. And it's about 7 feet high, and the central portion of it has partially collapsed. And the surface is filled with about a foot-thick layer of small stones. And each of these ends here is built on top of a existing boulder underneath. And the final feature we saw was this platform B. The interesting thing, that also has a surface of small stones, and at the other end, the north end, is this extension, almost like a tail, which is more clear in this other image. This is the so-called tail, which extends out. And it's interesting that I hadn't seen any other features like this near where I live in New Jersey or here at the Olie Hills Site, but I have found similar features up in Vermont. This is a large platform cairn in Newfane, Vermont, southern Vermont. Has a large white quartz cobble in the dead center of it. That faces north, by the way. And off to the south is this extension, this tail. This is the cairn right here, the same cairn I showed in the previous image. And in Stockbridge, Vermont is another cairn, here again with a white quartz. And that, I think, it also faces north. And off to the side was this tail. And then back is Ernie Clifford, who was a good friend of mine, who showed me many of the sites that I'm showing you now in Vermont. And this is a side view of the last major feature that I saw that day, which is an incline cairn. It's quite large. It's built again on top of a boulder on the east end. And in the east-facing side of the incline cairn are these 4 pieces of white quartz. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. And again, because it's quartz, it would have had to have been brought up to the feature to be incorporated, and from somewhere in the valley below, where there's probably a large seam of quartz. There's nothing like that on the ridge itself. And then in 1998, early, John Waltz was there. He worked with me very carefully in the early part of the investigation of the site. And he climbed on top of the incline cairn and found this piece of dolomite, which is heavily encrusted with a white crust, probably calcium carbonate. I never tested it. We tested the dolomite and determined that that's what it was. Dolomite often comes from a cave location. And it was interesting that there's this like nipple on the one end of it. And I've also found another piece of dolomite, which is this one here, which I found on the ground at the Olie site. And here you get this sort of like a formation of a stalagmite or stalactite, stalagmite. And this too is a piece of dolomite, and it would seem that these pieces are brought there from a cave location and then deposited on various sites, various features at the site. This is a metric scale at the bottom showing the scale of this is about 4.5 to 5 centimeters wide at the base. And other thing, at the base of the terrace, which I showed you before, John Waltz in 1998 found about a half dozen pieces of these cinders. I showed one of them to a friend of mine at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he thought it came from a furnace, from coal or whatever. But then I sent this particular piece, to Professor Robert Gordon at the Yale University, who examined it, didn't take any pieces from it, but concluded that it was made in a clay-lined hearth that contained a very hot fire. And there are also pieces of limestone and shale embedded in it. Limestone and shale are not found on the Oley Hills Ridge site, which means that this must have been formed somewhere in the valley below in a very hot fire, and then brought to the Olie Hills site to be deposited. I was trying to determine if this cinder and others, the other 5, were part of a cremation, but I was unable to do this, even after showing it to some experts in the field. And I've since decided I'm going to give these pieces to Jim Wilson, who's here today, and he will redeposit them at the Olie Hills site, probably at the terrace where they were found originally. And another piece that was found actually in front of what is called the platform A in the field below was this jasper scraper as a very conchoidal fracture at the very top end. And this is a scale here. Each square is a centimeter wide. And let's see, about a year or two ago, a state archaeologist was there, and she took a number of pictures of the different aspects of the site, and this was one of them that I looked at and I said, oh my God, there's a Manitou stone right in that photograph, which you see right here, head and shoulders, profile, and that's below the terrace that I showed you before. Whether any of these other stones represent Manitou stones, I have no idea, but certainly this one is. I had read a book by Carolyn Dean, which was titled, Carolyn Dean's book is called A Culture of Stone. Maybe some of you are aware of it. But it's a discussion of the Incas in Peru relationship to stone. And she has a section in there talking about integrated outcrops, in which she discusses the integrated stonework as the marriage between Inca culture and Mother Earth, which is on pages 81 following of her book. It's a very interesting book, and when I read that, I thought, gee, am I seeing integrated outcrops here at the Olie Hills Site? And I think I am. And it's interesting that John Waltz was on a walk yesterday with Jim Palmer, where they saw this very interesting wall site here in Pennsylvania, not far from here. And I looked at the photograph and said, of course, that wall site that was shown yesterday is part of this idea of an integrated outcrop, where the stonework is built so it appears to either merge with the stonework or emerge from it. So there's this cairn, which is the one that has the curved stone wall leading to it, but look how it's constructed against this tipped up stone, I don't know what you'd call it, a boulder, which looks to be on edge. And then there's this one I showed you before, which is built against this large boulder. But it appears as an extension here that it may be trying to mimic the boulder itself on the ridgetop. But I'm not sure, just an idea that I've had. And Carolyn Dean, when I wrote to her, she sent me this photograph that she had taken at Machu Picchu at the Temple of the Condor, which is called. And here you see the stonework and how, actually the outcrop, and how the stonework is built around that. Really interesting. The same thing you see at these Anasazi sites in the southwest in Arizona and New Mexico. So it's something to keep in mind when you go out there looking for sites. So in 1998, my wife and I were at the Olie Hills Site, and the landowner, who was really kind of strange, came up to me in an off-road vehicle and told us to leave. So we did. And I hadn't been back there until 2018. So for a good portion of time, I was having to do other things. I was traveling throughout the Northeast and Vermont especially. And I focused on this one site in Rochester, Vermont, on West Hill. I don't know if I've been there, but there are actually 4 main sites on West Hill. There's this one at the corner, which is really fascinating. I'm not going to talk about that. There's another one in a swamp. And there's the main site, which is the Smith site, the Chester Smith site, which has a number of R7-1. And there's a site also off the map, which is R7-6, which is an interesting site in itself, fairly small compared to the other sites that are shown on the map here. So Chester Smith, he moved to West Hill around in the 1840s, and the property that he purchased had been deeded early on in 1780, and then there was first purchased by, I forget the name of the couple that bought it in 1812. And the site is here, where that little square is. And to approach it there was by a cart road which extended this dotted line up there. The Smith site was isolated from others on West Hill. The others were connected by roads, such as you see here, but but the Smith site was really isolated. And I was able to locate the day books of Chester Smith, not far from where I lived in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. This is across the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, where the great-grandson of Chester Smith lived, and he had a chest in his garage, and in that were letters written by Chester Smith to his fiancée, and there were the day books that Chester Smith kept over a period of time that he owned this land. And going through the day books, there's no mention of building anything with stone. And the interesting thing is, too, that when Chester Smith first bought his property in the 1840s, only 5 acres of land had been cleared up to that time. And it turns out that the cairns are scattered over an area of between 50 and 60 acres, which shows that they were pre-existing before Smith bought his land. And when I left the Olie Hills Site and focused on the Smith site here, and then another one in Lockmere, I was attempting to establish a base of good information of sites that one had had firm dates as to when they were constructed. This is the Smith site and all the various cairns that are scattered over here. The house, the Smith house, was right around here. Just the foundations exist at the present time. And this is one of the flat-top cairns at the Smith site, and this is Ernie Clifford at one end of it. You can see the size of this. This is one of the largest platform cairns I know of. It's like 45 feet in one direction. And besides the Smith site, I spent some time looking at the site in Lockmere, New Hampshire, which it turned out was only about 25 miles from where we have a summer camp on the east side of New Hampshire. I read about Lockmere in the book by Maver and Dix, and they write about it as though it still exists with all of the walls and everything that you see here. But when I went there, I was disappointed not to find anything. It was just completely, all the old features were gone, and a couple of houses, one of which is in this proximate location down here, and the rest was kind of wooded. But I learned that there were 2 people who visited the site before it was visited in 1822 by Moore, and one of whom was Jeremy Belknap, the historian, who mentioned this site very briefly in his History of New Hampshire, which was published in 1793. He just describes it very, very, very briefly, and it's almost impossible to form a mental image of what it looked like. And also, Timothy Dwight, the future president of Yale University, visited in 1812, and he did the same thing, mentioned very briefly what it looked like. And it wasn't until 1822 when Moore, who was from Concord, New Hampshire, he was a publisher, if I remember correctly. He described it, made this map that you see here, and then sent the report to the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. And this is the first page of the report, which he sent to the society. And this design was also picked up by Squire, E.G. Squire, and engravings were made of it, and it was published in 2 books, one of which was one of the Smithsonian, I can't remember the name of it, from like 1845, 48, and also the same illustration was published in his book by Squire for the American Indian features in New York State. But then I found that the Moore Archive is located in Houghton Library at Harvard University. So I went there and I spent a whole day looking through the archive, and I found this map pasted in one of the books that Moore kept. And this is the original map on which everything else is based. In fact, he mentions it in the little square at the very bottom, and the actual date when he was there in September of 1822. So what was interesting about the wall structure made of stone, was the fact that there were these openings with a small mound built in back of it, of each of the openings, and that's a typical design characteristic of the Hopewell culture of Ohio. So this was all built of stone, and the stones apparently came from the Winnipesaukee River that you see here. So I went there, and in 2015, NEARA did a archaeological survey of this site using ground-penetrating radar, and they located one feature, which is this anomaly D, and it consists of small water-worn pebbles of stone, which probably represented the north wall of that structure which I showed you. When I retired from Princeton University in 2017, I was trying to decide what do I want to do in my retirement. Well, one of the things that interested me was the fact that we didn't really know how old the Oley Hills Site was, and we had we had really almost no dates for any of the sites we had investigated. And so I had been reading some articles that were written by a Greek scientist named Ioannis Laritsis, and he wrote articles about how to date known Greek and Egyptian temples using OSL, which is optically stimulated luminescence. I won't go in and describe how the technique works. You can read it online. But I asked him whether that technique might be useful to date gneiss, which is found as the bedrock found here in Pennsylvania. He said yeah, and told me to contact Jim Feathers in Washington State, which is what I did. And so Jim told me exactly how to approach the dating of this by taking 2 samples in the dark and wrap them in black plastic so no light exposes them, and then send them to Jim and he will do the analysis. So this is the tent that I bought, which had a covered floor, so I had opened up a flap in the tent, and John Walsh, who's here with me, he's the one that took the samples in 2018 and sent them to Jim. And about a year later, I think it was, we got the results back with the OSL dates for the terrace on which the samples were taken was dated to about 2500 BP, which means about 500 BC. So now we have a date for the terrace. And we had an earlier date for the cinder sample, because I was told by Professor Gordon at Yale that the cinder was probably formed in a clay-lined basin. I knew that thermoluminescence was a technique for dating clays. So that's the reason I had a laboratory in Guilford, Connecticut, date the cinder sample, and that came back about I forget, about 600 or 700 AD. So we have now 3 dates. The other date is from the platform B, at the site which I showed you before, and that was dated about 2 years ago. And that date is about 1,000 years younger than the terrace, which means that it's around 500 AD. So we now have 3 dates from the Olie Hills Site. This is just a shot of how the samples are drilled from the stone. This is one of the stones from the Olie site. And each hole is a centimeter across, and then there are 1 millimeter slices taken for each to determine how much of the slice has been irradiated. And this is when the NEARA group was on platform B, and here they've got the tent erected, and they're about ready. I wasn't there, couldn't be there at the time to watch this being done. And this is just, this is the bottom part of the Olie Hills Site, which was not described in my 2008 article, but I'm redoing the article, I'm updating it with this new information. And this is platform A, which is on the edge of a field. And this is an interesting structure. It's almost like a bleacher seat. It's about 6 feet high on the north end and about 3 feet high on this end, so it slopes down. And what it was used for, I'm not sure, but it's faces towards this field, and I can assume people might have been seated or standing on it. Here's John Walsh standing on the north lobe of the terrace, which I showed you before. And it turns out that particular location is in alignment with this massive 8-9 foot high, beautifully made cairn at the edge of a field at the bottom of the Olie Hills Site. So from the map that I showed you, here's the north lobe of the terrace. If there's a sight line, you can just see the top of that cairn, the top cairn I showed you, and it bisects the center of that platform A. What this all means, I'm not sure, but maybe it's something I'll try to tackle when I work on this updated article on the Olie Hills Site. So that's about it. Thank you very much.